The message came in at 12:14 in the morning. I know the exact time because I stared at it for almost 10 minutes before opening it. My phone lit up on a nightstand beside me, buzzing twice. One text, one email. I was 48 years old then. My name is Jason Murphy, and I had spent 19 years building systems for a logistics company most people outside manufacturing had never heard of. The kind of company that moved parts before factories shut down. The kind of company clients only noticed when something failed. Nothing had failed. At least, not yet. I remember my wife shifting beside me in bed when the phone vibrated again. "Everything okay?" she asked, half asleep. I looked at the sender and felt something tighten in my chest. Human Resources. Copied. Evan Rhodes, VP of Transformation. 33 years old. Perfect teeth. Expensive suits. MBA. Joined the company 11 months earlier and talked about agile restructuring like he invented efficiency. The text was short. "Please review the attached communication regarding immediate organizational changes affecting your position." I opened the email. No greeting worth remembering. No phone call. No meeting request. Just 3 paragraphs. Due to restructuring initiatives, my role had been eliminated effective immediately. Company property return instructions would follow. Benefits details would be sent separately. Access revoked upon receipt. 19 years. Reduced to an automated message sent after midnight. I read it again because my brain refused to believe it. 2 weeks earlier, I had trained 3 younger managers on emergency routing systems. I sat in a conference room explaining failover procedures while one of them checked sports scores under the table. A month earlier, I worked a holiday weekend because a client in Ohio was hours away from shutting down a production line. 3 years earlier, I spent Christmas Eve fixing corrupted shipment data from a ransomware scare. I missed dinners, vacations, anniversaries, not because anyone forced me, because I thought loyalty worked both ways. At 12:31 a.m., another email arrived. My building badge had already been disabled. Remote credentials terminated. VPN revoked. They moved fast. Fast enough that someone planned this before I knew. I walked downstairs into my home office and sat in the dark. 3 monitors. Old notebooks. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe to join our community. I share real workplace stories every day for anyone who believes quiet competence should always be respected. Sticky notes with numbers nobody else would understand. I worked in enterprise logistics software. Most of my job was invisible. If trucks moved, inventory synced, and factories stayed open, nobody asked questions. That was success. Preventing disasters nobody saw. I opened the termination email one last time. There was a sentence near the bottom. Cold. Legal. All proprietary materials and associated intellectual assets remain company property. I stared at those words longer than everything above them, because they believed code was the valuable part. Documentation. Servers. Access rights. What they didn't understand. The reason those systems stayed alive for 19 years was not the code itself. It was the person who knew why it existed. And at 12:42 that morning, sitting alone in my office, I realized something for the first time. They had fired me, but I wasn't sure they understood what they had actually removed. I didn't sleep after the message. I made coffee around 4 in the morning and sat in the dark while the house stayed quiet. Termination feels strange when it happens without witnesses. No box. No handshake. No security escort. Just silence. And silence gives memory too much room. I started thinking about the 19 years before that text. I was never the smartest guy in the room. Never the loudest either. I didn't have executive language. I wasn't good at presentations with colorful slides and phrases like transformation roadmap. I was good at something less visible. I noticed patterns. I knew where systems bent before they broke. I knew which clients panicked early and which waited too long. I knew what server failures looked like at 2 a.m. before alarms triggered. That became my career. Not building shiny things. Keeping ugly, complicated things alive. The company moved products for manufacturers across several states. Auto parts, industrial equipment, materials that delayed entire production lines if shipments disappeared. Over time, our systems became layers on top of layers. Old software connected to newer software. Temporary fixes became permanent. Emergency tools became critical infrastructure. I warned leadership for years. Document this. Replace that. Test failovers. Update recovery maps. Usually I heard the same answer. Next quarter. Not in budget. Low strategic priority. Then a storm hit one winter and routing failed in 3 regions. I fixed it. A ransomware attempt hit years later. I worked 30 hours with almost no sleep. We avoided major damage. Nobody outside operations knew. That was fine. Recognition wasn't why I stayed. At least that's what I told myself. Then Evan Rhodes arrived. Vice President of Transformation. 33. Consulting background. Sharp haircut. Fast talker. The kind of man who smiled while disagreeing with you. He called me experienced. Then old school. Then resistant. Always politely. In meetings, he'd say things like, Jason carries valuable legacy knowledge, but we need scalable thinking. People nodded. I sat there knowing scalable thinking sounded impressive until systems failed at midnight. He pushed automation, cost reduction, modernization. On paper, none of it sounded wrong. The problem was speed. You can renovate a bridge. You shouldn't remove support beams while trucks are crossing. I tried explaining that once. Nobody wrote it down. At home, things were different, more real. My daughter was finishing university, last year of tuition. My wife, Laura, had spent years dealing with medical expenses after surgeries that insurance only partly covered. We recovered mostly, but stability mattered. I carried that pressure quietly. Mortgage, bills, retirement that wasn't where it should be. I accepted extra work because dependable men often become invisible. People stop thanking you and start expecting you. I answered client calls during anniversaries. Canceled trips. Worked weekends. Not for bonuses. Because somewhere along the way, I tied being needed to being valued. That mistake took me years to understand. Around 5:30 in the morning after the termination text, I opened drawers in my office. Old notebooks. Award plaques. Conference badges. A company sweatshirt from 12 years earlier. I placed everything into boxes slowly. Not angry. Not crying. Just tired. Then I stopped and looked around the room. The strange thing about losing a job after 19 years isn't fear. Fear comes later. First comes clarity. And sitting there while the sun started rising, I realized something I should have understood long before midnight. I had spent years protecting people from consequences. Managers, executives, clients, systems. I covered gaps because I cared. I fixed mistakes before they became visible. I made leadership look smarter than they were. And for the first time in nearly 2 decades, I understood I was done protecting people who ended my career with a text message. By 8 in the morning, my phone looked like it belonged to someone else. Automated messages, offboarding forms, benefit notifications, instructions for shipping back equipment. One email informed me my access to the shipment tracking dashboard had been revoked. Another confirmed my corporate cloud storage was disabled. Every message sounded clean, professional, like 19 years could be closed with checkboxes. I kept waiting for the real call, not an apology. I wasn't expecting that. I expected urgency. Someone asking where emergency credentials were stored. Someone asking about the regional failover maps. Someone remembering the undocumented recovery procedures we used when overnight routing jobs stalled. Nothing came. At 8:43, an old coworker named Rick texted me. Short message. Sorry about what happened. Leadership announced transition this morning. Transition. I stared at that word. Like I'd moved apartments. Like I chose retirement. I called him. First thing he said was, they told everyone restructuring positions us for long-term growth. I laughed once. Not because it was funny. Because sometimes your body reacts before your mind does. Rick lowered his voice. They introduced Tyler as interim lead over operation support. Tyler, 30. Good guy mostly. Smart enough. But smart and prepared are different things. 2 weeks earlier, I watched him struggle to trace a routing error through systems I built years before he joined. Now he was leading. I pictured conference rooms. Executives speaking confidently. Slide decks. Words like optimization and continuity. Nobody mentioning the parts held together by habit and memory. I spent the next hour sitting in my home office. Coffee gone cold, watching sunlight move across old notebooks. I thought about sending documentation, not because they deserved it, because people lower down would suffer first. Analysts, night teams, operations staff, the people who stayed late. I opened a blank email. Subject line, important operational notes. I stared at the cursor, started typing, stopped, deleted, opened another document. Listed systems due for maintenance within days. Legacy monitors, backup scripts, manual checks, things I usually handled quietly. Again, I stopped, because a thought arrived that made me uncomfortable. For years, I believed loyalty meant stepping in before damage happened. But somewhere along the way, loyalty turned into unpaid insurance for decisions made above me. I covered weaknesses, protected timelines, softened consequences, and people in expensive offices began treating prevention like it happened by itself. I closed the document. No speech, no dramatic decision, just a quiet ending. I owed the company what already existed, nothing more. Around 10:30, another former coworker called. Then another. Questions started small. Do you remember where the archived recovery scripts live? Who owns permissions for regional rerouting? Did you ever finish the documentation on warehouse sink failures? I answered politely. General things. Nothing proprietary. Nothing extra. Then I stopped picking up. Not out of revenge. Out of exhaustion. Near 11, I checked LinkedIn. There it was. Corporate announcement. Restructuring initiative. Operational evolution. Gratitude for leadership. Comments from people congratulating executives for bold decisions. I closed the app. My stomach hurt more than I expected. Not from losing work. From watching years disappear in public language designed to sound positive. Then, a little after 11:30, a text appeared from someone whose number I knew immediately. Martin Cole, client contact, worked with me almost 13 years. Factory network in Indiana. The kind of man who never texted unless something mattered. Message said, Jason, your email bounced. Need to ask about unusual shipment delays. You available? I looked at the screen for a long time. My thumb hovered over the keyboard. Then I locked the phone and set it face down. For the first time in 19 years, I chose silence. The first sign wasn't panic. That's important. Companies rarely collapse all at once. They drift toward problems while insisting everything is fine. Just after noon, Rick called again. I almost ignored it. This time I answered. His voice sounded different. Tighter. You hear anything about cleanup orders? I frowned. What cleanup? Pause. Then, leadership approved removing unsupported legacy dependencies tied to former employees. I leaned back slowly. Who approved that? Transformation office. Maybe infrastructure too. They're archiving old scripts and shutting mirrored environments. Trying to simplify systems. Simplify. Another harmless word. Until it isn't. I knew immediately what he meant. Over years, I built layers around critical systems. Not glamorous things. Monitoring triggers. Fallback routes. Repair jobs that corrected errors before clients saw them. Temporary safeguards that became permanent because nobody funded replacements. I documented what policy required. But many protections survived because I maintained them. Adjusted them. Watched them. People mistake maintenance for invisibility. If something works long enough, executives assume it no longer needs attention. Tell me exactly what they're removing, I said. Rick listed names. 2 scripts. 1 mirrored recovery environment. Archived monitoring jobs. My stomach dropped. Not because destruction was immediate. Because I knew timing. Those systems existed for reasons forgotten years earlier. I stood from my desk and walked to the kitchen. Laura looked up. You okay? I nodded automatically. The kind of line married people recognize but don't challenge right away. By 1:30, more messages arrived. Former co-workers. Operations staff. Questions becoming sharper. One asked, did reroute alerts always lag this much? Another, any idea why overnight corrections didn't execute? Another, inventory syncs showing mismatches. Seen this before? I read everything. Answer nothing. Then Martin, the longtime client from Indiana, called. I watched it ring. 3 times. Voicemail followed. His voice was controlled, concerned, not angry. Jason, unusual shipment behavior started this morning. Team's looking into it. If you left documentation somewhere, maybe point us in the right direction. Left documentation. I almost smiled. Not out of satisfaction. Out of sadness. People always assume there's a folder. A master guide. One place holding years of judgment. There rarely is. Experience lives in repetition. Patterns. Knowing which warning matters and which doesn't. By mid-afternoon, Rick called again. No greeting this time. They disabled warehouse mirror B. I closed my eyes. How long ago? About an hour. I exhaled slowly. Warehouse mirror B wasn't a warehouse. It was a recovery environment. Old, expensive, ignored, used almost never, which made leadership believe it was unnecessary. It existed because 6 years earlier a routing failure nearly shut down 3 manufacturing clients. I built redundancy afterward. No celebration. No budget increase. Just prevention. The worst kind of success because nobody remembers what didn't happen. What now? Rick asked quietly. I looked out the window. Kids riding bikes down the street. Normal afternoon. Completely disconnected from conference rooms, beginning to sweat. Now, I said, now people start noticing. At first delays would appear small. Missing updates. Late syncs. Shipment inconsistencies. Then overnight corrections fail. Then clients ask questions. Then executives demand explanations. Then everyone searches backward. I knew the sequence because I spent years interrupting it before anyone else saw. Around 4:30, my phone buzzed again. Different number. Corporate directory extension. I let it ring out. Voicemail arrived seconds later. I recognized the voice immediately. David Hensley, Director of Operations. Ignore my warnings more times than I could count. Praised urgency, but cut resilience budgets. The message lasted 12 seconds. No small talk. No apology. Just this. Jason, call me when you can. We're seeing strange behavior in production. I replayed it once. Then again. Not because I enjoyed hearing concern. Because after 19 years, it was the first honest sentence anyone from leadership had spoken all day. By the next morning, the situation stopped feeling like confusion. It started feeling like pressure. Not sudden pressure. The kind that builds slowly until people realize they've been holding their breath too long. My phone didn't stop ringing. Former co-workers first. Then team leads. Then people I barely spoke to unless something was already broken. Rick called again before I could finish my coffee. His voice was lower this time. Tired. Inventory sync errors are spreading, he said. It's not just one region anymore. I didn't answer right away, because I already knew what that meant. When a system like ours starts failing across regions, it doesn't mean a bug. It means the invisible structure underneath is gone. What are they saying internally? I asked. He hesitated. Leadership says it's a cloud provider issue. They think it's temporary. I looked at the kitchen counter. A half-empty mug. A newspaper I hadn't read. Temporary was a dangerous word in that building. Temporary always meant someone below me would stay late fixing it. By mid-morning, I started hearing from clients indirectly. Not calls to me personally yet, but messages going through people who still have my number. Martin Cole texted again. We're seeing shipment delays across 3 suppliers. Management says it's being resolved. I don't think they understand the pattern. Pattern. That word hit harder than the rest, because patterns are what I spent 19 years seeing before anyone else did. I didn't reply immediately. Instead, I sat at my desk and listened to silence. No alerts. No dashboards. No emergency pings. For the first time, I realized something strange. When I was inside the system, I was constantly needed. Now that I was outside it, the system was still breaking just without me in it. By noon, the calls changed tone. Not curiosity anymore. Urgency. A former analyst from operations called me almost panicked. Jason, do you remember the overnight correction jobs? Yes. They're failing silently. No alerts are triggering. That detail mattered. Silent failure is worse than visible failure. Visible failure gets attention. Silent failure spreads. I closed my eyes. They removed the monitoring layer, I said quietly. A pause. Then, you're sure? I built it. I know what got removed. I could hear breathing on the other end. Fast. Uneven. Like someone walking through a building, suddenly realizing the lights don't work. Then came something new. Clients started asking for me by name. Not support tickets. Not formal escalation paths. Direct requests. Is Jason Murphy available? Can we speak to him directly? Who handled routing logic before the change? That last one came from a procurement manager at a major client. Martin forwarded it to me. No comment. Just forwarded text. At that point, I understood something clearly. My value was never just technical. It was trust. People didn't trust the system. They trusted the person who had never let it fail. By mid-afternoon, leadership finally reacted. Not publicly. Internally. Rick told me they were holding emergency coordination calls, trying to trace failures across teams that now contradicted each other. Every explanation created new questions. Every fix caused another delay. The younger VP of transformation was still insisting it was transition turbulence. I almost laughed when I heard that, because turbulence is what you call it when you don't want to admit the plane is losing structure. Around 3, Rick called again. But this time his voice wasn't just tired. It was careful. Jason, they want to know if you've documented system dependencies anywhere. I didn't answer immediately, because I had documented them. Hundreds of times. But documentation doesn't matter if nobody reads it. They didn't want it before, I said. Silence. Then Rick quietly added, yeah, I know. Later that day, Martin called again. This time I answered. He didn't waste words. Jason, our main contract review has been moved up. They're concerned about reliability. I listened, and he said something I didn't expect. We've worked with your system for over a decade. If you left, we need to understand what changed. I stared at my desk. Nothing changed. That was the problem. Nothing was maintained. Just assumed. I'll call you later, I said. And I meant it. But not yet. Because by evening, the calls weren't just requests anymore. They were confirmations. Something was already breaking in ways leadership could no longer explain away. And for the first time since midnight, the company was no longer talking about restructuring. They were talking about survival. I didn't see the emergency meetings, but I heard enough to know exactly when they started. Around morning, Rick sent a message with just 3 words. Board involved now. That changed everything. Because executives handle problems. Boards handle consequences. By midday, consultants have been brought in. External teams. Expensive ones. The kind that arrive with clean laptops and polite confidence and leave behind uncomfortable questions. Rick said the younger VP of transformation tried to explain the situation as inherited technical debt. That phrase again. Technical debt. A soft way to describe years of ignoring warnings. At home, I sat in the same chair I had been sitting in since the termination. I wasn't fixing anything. I wasn't helping. For the first time, I was outside the system watching it describe itself incorrectly. Then something unexpected happened. My phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but I did. A calm voice spoke. Older. Controlled. This is Mark Ellison. Board advisory. I sat up slightly. I've been told you were previously responsible for core logistics architecture. Not a question. A statement. Yes, I said. He paused. I'd like you to participate in a continuity discussion. Informal. No employment status attached. I didn't respond immediately, because that was the first time in years someone spoke to me without assuming I was already replaceable. Later that day, Rick confirmed what I already suspected. They had found my old warnings. Emails. Meeting notes. Risk assessments. All archived. All ignored. One message I wrote 2 years earlier apparently resurfaced during review. If legacy dependencies are removed without full mapping, regional routing stability will degrade within operational hours. I remembered writing it. I also remembered the silence that followed it. Now it had reappeared in a board packet. At home, Laura asked me if I was going back. I shook my head. Not as an employee, I said. That distinction mattered more than it should have. Because this wasn't about pride. It was about structure. And for 19 years, I was part of a structure that only worked because someone was quietly holding it together. That evening, Rick called again. His voice was different now. Not panicked. Not tired. Careful again. They want you in a call tomorrow. Board level. Consulting capacity only. I looked out the window. The sky was dark. Quiet. Somewhere in the city, people were staying late, trying to understand a system I already knew was missing pieces. Tell them, I said slowly. I'll listen. A pause. But I'm not returning as staff. Rick didn't argue. He just said, yeah, I figured. After the call ended, I sat in silence for a long time. No satisfaction, no anger, just clarity. For the first time since midnight. They weren't calling me because I worked there. They were calling because the system had finally admitted what I always knew. It couldn't run without understanding. And I was the only one left who still remembered how it understood itself. The board call felt different before it even started. Not because of what was said, because of who was silent. The same executives who used to dominate meetings were careful now. Measured. Waiting. I joined from my home office. No company laptop. No VPN. Just a personal device and a link sent by legal. Mark Ellison from aboard opened first. Jason, we appreciate you joining under short notice. I kept my voice steady. I'm here to understand what you're dealing with, not to rejoin the company. A pause followed. That single sentence changed the tone. Then Evan Rhodes spoke, the VP of Transformation, the same man who once called my work legacy thinking. His voice was different now, less confident. We're experiencing instability across multiple routing systems. Some dependencies weren't fully mapped during transition. I almost laughed again, but I didn't, because that phrase, weren't fully mapped, meant they had removed things without understanding what they did. And now reality was responding. Slowly, but clearly, they began explaining numbers. Delayed shipments, client escalations, contract reviews pulled forward, revenue at risk. I listened without interrupting. For years, they never listened to me like this. Now every word I said carried weight they couldn't ignore. Mark asked directly, what would it take to stabilize operations? I didn't answer immediately, not because I didn't know, but because I understood the cost of being too useful again. Finally, I said, first, I am not returning as an employee. Silence. Then I continued. I will consult. Limited scope. Defined access. Written authority only. Evan tried to respond quickly. We can discuss reinstatement. No, I said firmly. One word. Not emotional. Just final. That ended the negotiation in a different way than they expected. Mark stepped in. What are your terms? I leaned back slightly. And for the first time since midnight, I stopped feeling like someone being removed from a system. I felt like someone setting boundaries with it. Consulting rate, I said, is 3 times my previous salary. Minimum engagement is documented. No informal requests. No verbal directives. Everything goes through a single point of contact. Another pause. They weren't used to this version of me. Not the quiet fixer, but the man who no longer needed approval to be useful. Then I added one more condition. I will not take responsibility for decisions made after my termination unless I directly approve remediation steps. That one landed harder, because it meant ownership came back to them, not me. The meeting continued, but the dynamic had shifted completely. Rick texted me during the call. They're panicking internally. Clients are escalating fast. I didn't reply, because I could already hear it in their voices. The company wasn't just losing stability. It was losing confidence. And confidence in systems like this is everything. By the end of the call, Mark summarized carefully. So to be clear, you will assist in restoring operational stability under consulting terms. Yes, I said, but I'm not part of your organization. Evan didn't like that. I could hear it in the silence that followed. But he didn't argue, because argument doesn't matter when systems are already breaking. After the call ended, I sat still for a long time. My phone stayed quiet for almost 10 minutes. Then it started again. Messages from former coworkers. Relief. Confusion. Gratitude. One simply said, things are stabilizing already just knowing you're involved. That sentence stayed with me longer than I expected, because it wasn't code they trusted. It was judgment. That evening, Rick called again. His voice was almost relieved. They've paused restructuring changes. Everything's frozen until your review. Frozen. A company that moved fast enough to fire me in the middle of the night was now standing still, waiting, not because of fear, because they had finally hit something they couldn't automate away. Before I ended the call, Rick said quietly, feels like they only understood what you did after you were gone. I didn't respond immediately, because that was the truth none of them wanted to say out loud. "I guess we'll see," I said finally. But inside, I already knew they didn't just need fixes. They needed understanding. And understanding always comes too late when you confuse presence with importance. Months passed in a way that didn't feel dramatic. No explosions. No final collapse. Just steady repair. Controlled conversations. Structured consulting. Clear boundaries that slowly became normal. I never went back as an employee. I stayed outside the system while helping stabilize it. That distance mattered more than I expected. My days changed first. Then my home did. Laura noticed it before I did. I wasn't waking up tense anymore. I wasn't checking messages at night. For the first time in years, silence didn't feel like waiting for disaster. My daughter graduated that spring. I sat in the audience and realized I had never fully been present for moments like this before. Not because I didn't care, but because I was always mentally inside a system that demanded constant attention. The company recovered slowly, not because it became smarter overnight, but because it finally documented what it had ignored for years. They rebuilt monitoring layers. They mapped dependencies properly. They stopped removing things they didn't understand. Evan Rhodes stayed, but his influence changed. Leadership stopped treating experience like something replaceable. They learned that lesson the hard way. But I didn't feel victory. Not really. What I felt was distance. One evening, months after it all began, I sat in my office again. Same chair, same room, but different weight in my chest. I thought about that midnight message. 12:14 a.m. A text that was supposed to erase me quietly. Instead, it revealed something I hadn't fully understood before. Being needed is not the same as being valued. I had spent years inside a building that confused the two. My phone vibrated once. A client message. Then another. Then silence again. I looked at the screen and didn't feel urgency anymore. Just perspective. If that message had never arrived, I might still be there. Still protecting systems that didn't protect me. Still carrying responsibility that outlived respect. I turned the phone face down, and for the first time in a long time, I understood something simple. Losing access to a building is not the end of your value. Sometimes it's the first time you ever get to see it clearly. And that was the real ending. Not revenge. Not collapse. Just clarity.